guys, welcome back. This week we'll be in Philippians chapter 2, verse 12 to 18. So take a chance to now read that with your small group and pause and return. This week we're going to be talking about this idea of how do we work out our faith? What kind of work goes into our faith? And I think, again, it does hit on very basic things that we know about Christianity, and yet it's something that I don't think we understand very well. And I don't think, today's sermon will be able to help us fully understand what it's like to grow in one's faith, but I think we need to begin to answer questions about what responsibility do we have to grow in our own faith. And I think it's especially important as we, in this COVID time, have been forced to rely on our own understanding of faith and how do we pursue God in a time when no one is around us to force us to come to God. And maybe it's these questions that I've heard a lot that spark this topic, but I'd hear from a lot of people things like, I don't know how to grow as a Christian. I don't know what to do. My faith seems to be going nowhere, and it feels like nothing's changing. What am I supposed to do? How do I grow? And these are good questions, and I think these are questions that need to be answered if we are to grow as Christians. And so that means we do need to understand what our responsibility is. And so we seek clarity today. We're just going to be answering three questions. First one is, what is your responsibility to grow your faith? How are you responsible to grow yourself? Second question is, how is God responsible for your growing in your faith? And then the third one is, how does it practically look like to grow in our faith? What are some application points, okay? Let's start off. How are you responsible for your faith? Let's start in verse 12. This is Apostle Paul. It says, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." All right, and so some context here. Again, in this letter at this point in chapter 2, Paul has just laid out the example of Christ's humility and how he went to die on a cross and self-sacrificed in order to save humanity. And then he says, starting here in verse 12, therefore, in other words, because of what Jesus has done, the example he set before you, now you, all right, building off of what Jesus has done, now you Philippians, you need to, even though I'm not there with you, work out your own faith. All right, you need to work out your own salvation. And so we need to pause there, because I think immediately we have some issues we need to deal with. To work out one's own salvation, does that mean one can save themselves? Do you do the work to save yourself? In other words, we're asking. And I think if that's the case, that kind of flips everything on its head. Everything we think we know about Jesus and everything we know about our faith. And so thankfully there are some clues here, some hints that Paul leaves for us to help us understand what he's actually saying. If you see, the word therefore, it means it's pointing us back to something else, right? Some other foundational piece. And so we know that the foundational piece that comes right before this is the gospel. It's Jesus's self-sacrifice, him putting himself on the cross, dying for our sins. And so he's saying that Jesus's work is the foundation of the argument that he's making right here. And he also says, my beloved, therefore my beloved. And so we know that he's talking to believers, right? Therefore, as Christ has done, right, as he has died for us, and I call you my beloved, it means I'm talking to Christians, people who are already saved, meaning one working out their own salvation is not saving yourself. Okay, and so take note of that. That means Paul's not preaching that you can somehow save yourself. And so if that's the case, what is he saying? We do need to ask ourselves. If he is talking to those who are already saved, that means, well, clearly he's not talking about salvation, but something else. And it's this idea of sanctification, right? This idea of becoming less like sin and more like God. All right, sanctification is becoming less like sin, more like God. It's the natural transformation that happens within us when we become a believer. And so he's saying, don't work for your salvation, but rather work out your salvation, meaning you have a responsibility in growing in your faith. And that means you need to put intentional work into growing as a believer. You personally, if you would call yourself a Christian, have that responsibility. And so it helps that Paul is speaking to those who are currently not in his presence, and so it helps us understand a little bit of the context to be in this COVID situation. I'm not with you guys. Your counselor's not with you guys. We're all separated. And just like Paul is saying, right now, even though I'm not in your presence, but much more in my absence, so even more so because I'm not with you, you need to be careful to work out your salvation. Right? It's this exhortation to those who are separated from their mature discipler, Paul, and he's saying, even though I can't be with you guys, even more so now, because we're not together, you need to be intentional, you need to be fighting to grow, and you need to essentially take responsibility for your own growth. Okay? You need to learn to seek God on your own. It is imperative. And so here's the thing, maybe in this COVID situation, I know we've said this before, and I think it bears repeating, this is a situation that I think many of us need and needed before we go off to college. I think oftentimes we don't realize, but for many of us church kids, we don't really know what it's like to take initiative in our own faith. That we're used to people hand feeding us, right? People forcing us to read the Bible, spend time with God. Counselors have to text you 10,000 times because you won't respond to the first 9,999 texts when they're asking you, how are you doing in your faith? How are you growing? How are you being challenged? And just like, I don't want to deal with it, until they push you even more, and you're like, okay, fine, I'll respond. Or the pastor's up there yelling at you. I'm like going purple in the face, trying to make you pay attention to the Bible and actually care, and you're just like, man, I'd be rather playing my Switch right now. Like, my turnips need to be harvested. I need to build something in Minecraft. Like, I ain't got time for this stuff. And yet it's being hand-fed to you, and so you're like, I don't understand what it means. You need to tell me what it means. And we're just used to having someone else's faith being poured into us. And at this point in this COVID situation, you're finally on your own. You get to say what you want to do, whether or not you want to pursue God or not. And if you want to, you could just ignore us. Some of you are already doing that very well. Some of you just don't care about worshiping together. You don't care about reading the Bible together. You don't care about the Bible in general. And this perhaps is why we need to hear Paul's word. He's saying, yeah, I might not be with you, but that means even more so, because you have no one watching over you and guiding you. You need to take personal responsibility for who you call yourself to be as a Christian. You need to be responsible for your own faith. You need to work out your own salvation. And so here's the thing. You are responsible for your faith. No one else is. This is why many people, when they go off to college, they stop following Christ. It's because they never had a faith in the first place of their own, because their faith has always been their parents' faith, their friends' faith, something that they felt influenced by the crowd that they were in, and suddenly once they leave, the college experience shows them that they have freedom, that no one is hand feeding them anymore, and either they realize they never wanted Jesus, or they realize they never knew how to work out their own salvation. And we don't want that for you. We want to fight that. Okay? And so what does this mean? It means you and I have to take care to actually learn how to follow Jesus. We got to take responsibility to do the hard work of growing in our love for God. It means we need to actually seek Him. We need to actually pursue Him. We need to study Him. We need to draw near to Him, be intimate with Him. It means we need to be intentional with Him. We need to speak honestly from our hearts with Him. Just imagine if you were married to someone, and someone else outside of the relationship had to remind you every so often of, hey, you should talk to your spouse, right? And anybody seeing that would know that there's something wrong with this relationship. If you truly love someone, you pursue them, you seek them out, you try to know them, you try to find out how to best love this person, what hurts them, what fills them with joy. You shouldn't need someone else to tell you how to love the person you're called to love. There's something wrong with that relationship. It's not a relationship. Um, and unfortunately, that's us. We're the ones who often need to be reminded to go talk to God. And I think it reveals how immature we are. And for Paul, he's telling us, grow up. Take responsibility for your own salvation. Work on it. Right? It's not your parents' job, it's not your counselor's job, it's not your pastor's job, although all of us are called to help you and walk with you in this time as you're young. But it ultimately means that you personally need to take responsibility for your relationship with God. Okay? And so this idea that we often hear is, let go and let God. And it's almost like this dismissive thing where it's like, yeah, you don't need to worry about it. God will take care of it, which is true. God will take care of all situations of His children. He'll care for us. But it almost gives the sense of you don't need to do anything. Like you don't need to take responsibility for pursuing Him, and that's false. It's completely false. You need to do something. You need to pursue Him. You need to seek Him, and for you who call yourself Christian, you need to be rebuked, as I do. Right? We need to actually pursue our God. We are called to actually find Him, and it's not that He's running away from us. It's that we've blinded ourselves with our own sins and our own idolatries, and He's right here, right? And often we hear excuses like, "Oh, it's hard to grow," or "Oh, it's I just don't know how to." And I gotta be honest with you. Yes, being a Christian is hard. Growing in your faith is hard. But that's not an excuse, right? The gospel is, of course, hard to hear, and it's hard to grow because it's hard to hear your own sins and to see your own ugliness. It's like if you go into surgery, if you have cancer, right? You know surgery is going to hurt. You know it sucks. It's cutting open your body to take out what is killing you, and yet you don't, see people going into surgery and they're like, oh yeah, it's easy, it's painless. No, they know it's going to be hard, they know it's going to hurt, yet they know it's good, and they still want to do it because it'll take out the very thing that's killing them. Yes, growing is hard, but if you want to live, it's a necessity. You need it, it's good for you in the end. Right? In the same way, of course, growing up in the faith, working on your faith, there are many things you're not going to know. That's natural, that's normal, part of growing in a relationship, right? It's going to take time, you're learning, and it's a process, right? No one goes into a relationship thinking like, oh, I don't know what the other person likes, but even though it's her birthday, it's too hard, I just don't know, I'm just going to go play Minecraft instead. That's how you end a relationship. That's not a relationship. That's one that's about to implode and burn down. If you love someone, you seek to know them so that you know how to best celebrate them and love them and care for them. And so this is a wake-up call, I think, for many of us. I don't want to yell very much, but if I could yell anything to you right now, it's this. Laziness is death, right? Your spiritual laziness brings forth death. Your spiritual apathy brings forth death. It means that you need to pursue, you need to wake up, you need to actually run after our God, you need to toss aside the things that get in your way, and you need to find the source of life. Right? You need to get up and fight the very things that take away your attention from Him. And that means you need to take responsibility for your own faith. This is not on anyone else, this is on you and God alone. And if you need to, if you don't understand, if things are hard, seek out the ones who have walked ahead of you. The older people who have pursued God and struggled and wrestled in the same way, and ask them for help, for advice. Like, how do you grow? How do you take responsibility for your own faith? What are some habits you have that help you come near to God on a regular basis? And I know this. Like I personally went through the same struggle where everything else in the world, everything else in my room seemed more interesting than this, the Word. And I think that just shows that kind of posture towards God's word actually reveals what we feel about God. If his words mean nothing to you, if it's just boring literature, well, then God and you don't really have much of a relationship, do you? Right? If you receive a love letter from the person you love the most in your life, it fills you with joy. You can't wait to read it. And yet we look at this as if it's just like, I don't know, his toilet paper or something. I mean, if that's the case, I don't know how much we love our God. And yet this is his greatest love poured out in these pages through his son. And I gotta ask you, like, how is it that we toss him aside for every worthless thing that we come across? We need to be rebuked. We need to wake up. And so maybe we need to change our heart posture. Look at the second part of verse 12. Not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And I want you to focus on that last few words, with fear and trembling. I think it helps us correct our hearts towards God, because oftentimes we do not fear this God. Right? We fear everything else but God. We fear man, but we do not fear God. We are afraid of being unliked, unpopular. We're afraid of people disliking us or calling us names, or all these, yes, horrible things, but these things don't compare to God. And I think we need to understand who our God is. Yes, we love it that he is a lamb, he's a gentle, kind, patient father, and yet we forget that he's a lion, like ready to rip anything's head off, right? He's ready to kill and destroy, and he's able to do all to anybody. And perhaps Matthew 10, verse 28 helps us understand this. Jesus says, "And do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell." Right? Don't fear the things of this world. They can do you temporary damage, but the one who is able to destroy eternally, that's the one you need to fear. That's the one you need to be in awe of. Right? And that's God seen correctly. He who's able to create and also to destroy. And he has, the thing is, he has every right to destroy unholy people, unrighteous people, because he is a holy God, and he demands holiness and righteousness from all. That's what makes him holy, and that's what makes him righteous, and that's why he's a good God. It's because he demands that for this universe. And so that means for us, when we look at God, we are not to take him lightly. That means what we do on a daily basis when we toss him aside for worthless things, man, that just shows how foolish we are, doesn't it? You and I turn him away so that we can fool around with things that have little to no impact on our eternal well-being. And yet the one that we've just tossed aside is able to destroy eternally. He needs to be feared and in awe of. And we are similar to the Israelites. Right? They saw his majesty, his power in Egypt. They saw his 10 plagues and how he brought the strongest nation to its knees. They saw all that, and they instantly turned on him as soon as they were in the wilderness. They did not fear him. They did not tremble before him. And so this is Paul's exhortation to us. And he says, he points us to the heart. He says, you and I, we need to respect him and be in awe of him. And the good news for us here is this God, even though he is able to destroy, is a God of love. Right? We know that he is for us and not against us. And that brings us to point number 2. How is God responsible for our faith? How is he responsible for your faith? Verse 13, let's look. It says, "For it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure." And immediately we find that God is shown to be responsible for working in us as we grow. And we want to focus on again, that first word, "for," right? It's pointing us backwards. It's saying, this is the reasoning why I said what I just said. And he's saying God is the reason we are able to work out our faith. Yeah, he gives us that command, work out your own faith, your own salvation, because it is God who works in you. He is the one who makes this possible. And so we need to ask the question, how? How did God make it possible? Well, he shows us. For it is God who works in you both to will and to work. So let's focus on those two things, to will and to work. In other words, what Paul is saying is he is the one who gives us the desire, the will to grow. Right? Both to will, meaning he gives us the desire to work out our own salvation, and then he also says to work, and it's incredible if we just think about what that actually means, right? The fact that he gave us the very will to know Jesus, the fact that when we have a desire to know God, that means that desire came from God. He gave us the desire to know him. Right? And think about that, because anybody who knows Jesus is very clear in their mind. We know that if it was left to our own devices, our own choices, we would not choose God. 100 out of 100 times we would choose everything else, because everything else is so tempting, right? I mean, just what we were talking about at first. If I come into my room and my Bible's sitting here along with everything else, I choose everything else over my Bible, and that's the natural inherent sinfulness of my heart. I reject God for lesser things. And yet what God is telling us is, if you desire God, it is his given desire to us. I mean, that's amazing. And in our own strength, like once we have the desire, yes, that's God given, but the strength and the decision to follow him and actually act on that desire also comes from him. Right? I mean, even if I had the desire to know him, if I somehow came up with that desire on my own, like, oh, logically I would want to follow Jesus, I would not be able to have strength and might to actually act on those things, because of my sinful heart. It's so powerful. I don't have the strength to fight my own sins. And those of you who fight habitual sins that continually come up, and sins that continually bring us to our knees, we know how weak we are. Left to myself and my own strength, I don't have what it takes to fight. But what we find here is that God's saying, I will give you the desire to know me. I will give you the strength to fight to know me. These all come from me. I give you my own Spirit, who empowers you with my strength to fight for holiness. That's incredible. That's what God is doing as we seek to be sanctified, to become less like sin and more like him. And so let that sink in for a second. Let that realization of what grace you have actually received. I mean, think about it. The fact is that us coming to him, to know him, to want him, to be willing and able to work on that desire, it is all God's doing. It is not my ingenuity, it's not my wisdom, it's not my mastery of logic and common sense that brought me to this place. It is God himself who has led me to himself. I mean, if that's not grace, I don't know what is. Right? The fact is, if I was able to come up with it on my own, if I was able to will myself to follow him by myself, then that's not grace. It's not the gospel anymore. It is what I've done. It's my righteousness, my goodness, my smarts, my intelligence. But God is saying, no, you don't understand. I've done that all for you. I've paved the way for you, because if I left it to you, you would never reach me. That's why we find the law is in the Bible. The law of the Old Testament that we read about was given to show us how unable we are to find him, how unable we are to work out our own salvation. The law was given to show us our inabilities and to point us to Jesus, the one who is able to bring us to himself. That's the grace of the gospel. That's why the gospel is so important. It's saying, you can't do it, but I can, and I will do it for you because I love you. Friends, that's what makes Jesus so amazing. He made the way where there was no way, through his own perfection and his love for humanity. And so that's how God is responsible for my salvation. And the fact is that he continually gives grace, and this is how he's responsible for my growth on a daily basis. He gives me the will to obey him, and he gives me the strength to obey him. And look here, maybe we need to ask the question why. Like, why does he do this? Why does he give me the desire for himself and the will to seek it? And that's going to be important. Look at verse 13 again. For it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. And again, look at those last few words, for his good pleasure. This is his reasoning. The reason he has given us the gospel and he has made a way for us, it is for his good pleasure. God did it because he delights in us, because he delights in our transformation. Do you understand what this is actually saying? Right? He saves people, he sanctifies them for his own good pleasure. Meaning, he finds delight, he finds pleasure when he sees us growing in our faith. Right? And just think about that for a second. What religion, what philosophy, what psychology could ever explain a faith like this? We have a God who chose unworthy people who did not want him, right? Who are so foolish and weak that they would never ever come to him by their own understanding or strength, and that he would give them his own desire, he would give them his own will and power to come to himself, to be saved and to be sanctified and turned against their own sinful heart so that we would become more like him. And he finds pleasure in that. Right? He delights as we grow in his likeness. It's like a father who gives birth to children, and he sees how naughty they are and how inherently wicked they are, and as he teaches them, as he grows them up to, and he sees them becoming like him, growing in his image, looking more like their father each and every day, he finds delight in how we are growing. That's the reasoning behind God's actions. He does it for his good pleasure. He's filled with joy, and I mean, it's incredible because our God is delighting in you. He finds delight in you as you receive his grace and mercy. He is pouring out his own grace, his own mercy on us, and he delights in that. This is a good father. And so when you're dealing with temptations, when you're struggling with anger, with pride, with lust, with idolatries, all these things that daily on a daily basis attack us, and we fight those things, we struggle, and we push back, and we use the strength given by God to fight against these things. He is rejoicing. He's filled with delight and pleasure. Because we're choosing to fight for holiness. We're choosing to be like our Father, and he celebrates with us as we become more like him. And this pleasure of his needs to be a part of why we choose to grow. The pleasure that he has in our growth needs to be part of why we obey and take responsibility for our own faith. It's not just his pleasure, but it must give us pleasure as well to know that we are becoming more like our dad. Yes, on one hand, we talked about the fear of God as a motivating factor for our working out our own faith, but also, on the other hand, it's pleasure too. It's both fear and pleasure, right? I get to be like my dad. I get to love him, and the more I get to know him, the more I know he loves me, right? And I know that it'll make him happy to see me growing, and so I want to follow him. I want to pursue him. I want to work out my own salvation, and so it's both fear and pleasure. It's awe and delight, and it's like any relationship, right? If I know something makes so and so happy, the person I love, Olivia, if it makes Olivia happy, and I know that, then I want to do whatever I can to bring forth that delight in her, because it gives me pleasure to see her delighting. And so if we actually love our God like we say we are supposed to, ultimately what we seek to do is what brings them the most pleasure, and what brings God the most pleasure. And so, friends, I need to ask you that. What drives you to grow? It can't just be fear, right? Fear is important, but if it's just fear, then all we have is a dictator. And we know that's not true because we just saw what God has done and why he's doing it. And so if it's both fear and pleasure, if it's both fear and love, because he's a loving God, we find that following him, obeying him, working out our own salvation, these things fill us with joy too, with rejoicing. And let that sink in for a second, all right? He delights in our goodness. He delights in our growth. I don't know if there's a better truth than that. That's the God we serve. And so let's quickly finish off with the last point. How does growing look like in our faith? Right? Application-wise, what does it practically look like to grow in our faith? And so Paul gives us a paragraph of things to look for, applications. In verse 14, he immediately says, "Do all things without grumbling or disputing." Right? He immediately addresses our actions of grumbling, disputing, things that come out of our mouth, and he says, all things. It doesn't matter what's going on. Do all things without grumbling or disputing. And so covers all the bases. He says, do so without grumbling or disputing. Why? It seems easy enough until you realize that both these things point to a heart issue. They point to discontentment, a heart that doesn't find God to be enough. We just looked at Israel. They grumbled as soon as they got out of Egypt, and that sinfulness revealed their discontented hearts with God, that they thought he was not enough for them. And that was their sin. It wasn't so much that they said things, it was because in their hearts they doubted his goodness. They did not trust him. They did not fear him or love him. And so therefore, in verse 15, he continues, that you may be blameless and innocent, meaning if you do grumble and dispute, it shows how sinful we are, right? And he says, do so that you will be blameless, you will be innocent, you will be children of God without blemish. So you will be pure, holy, okay? In the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. That's the same title that was given to Israel as they came out of Egypt. And he said, don't be like them. Don't be like the world. Rather be without grumbling, without disputing, and set yourselves apart. And we see that in the end of verse 15, right? Among whom you shine as lights in the world. By having a heart that trusts in God, that looks to him for all provision, you are setting yourselves apart from this world. You will shine as lights in a dark world. The way you live, the way you see God. And then he points them to their very core, right? Unlike the world, you need to do what? Verse 16, holding fast to the word of life. Holding fast to the words of life. Friends, I know your Bible's dusty. I know some of you guys can't find your Bibles because you ain't touched that thing in who knows how long. And even if you touched it, it wasn't because you wanted to, it's because your counselor or I told you to do so. Do you see these as the words of life? You hear what it's called? The words of life, meaning this holds life itself. Friends, maybe we need to be rebuked again. See, the world doesn't hold this as the words of life. And yet, for Paul, he's saying, if you want to be shining as a light in this dark world, if you want to be set apart from this twisted and crooked generation, hold fast to the God of the Bible. Hold fast to his words. Meaning, cling on to him as if he can give you salvation and nothing else can. Don't let it go. Don't look elsewhere. Make it your foundation. Look to God for all answers. And because when you do that, you actually begin to find that your heart transforms. As he becomes life, you find that there's no greater thing. You find that the gospel is indeed greater than you could ever imagine. And that's why Paul, is able to hold fast even though he's suffering. That's why, the end of this passage is incredible, right? Even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, meaning even if I die, even if I lose all things, even if my life is nothing in the service of bringing you Jesus, what does he say? I am glad and rejoice with you all. It's because he has held fast to the words of life. Because this is his foundation, this is his joy. He is able to rejoice with them and be glad with them. And he even commands them to do the same. In 18, likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me. Guys, we have the words of life here. This is our foundation, this is our joy. And if we have this, if we have Jesus, we are able to rejoice and be glad in all situations. We have enough. God has given us more than we could ever ask for. So, application, I mean, ask yourself, what is at your foundation? What is giving you life? What gives you joy and gladness and reason to celebrate, even in the midst of darkness? Is it Christ? And if it isn't, what imitation are you looking at? And be honest with yourself. Where's it bringing you? If it's not life itself, is it worth seeking?